Photo ID. Without one, there's a lot you can't do. You need it to drive a car, get into R-rated movies, buy alcohol, get on a plane, and in some places, you need it to vote. That seems reasonable, right? All those things are pretty important to regulate. Across the country, state legislators have passed laws requiring voters to show photo ID before they cast a ballot. Here in Texas, we like to do things our own way, which means it's a little complicated. Voter ID laws have gotten passed, and those laws have gotten blocked. And the whole time, people have been asking the same question. Do voter ID laws in Texas protect the vote? In 2011, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 14, SB 14 for short. It required all Texas voters to present government-issued photo IDs at the polls. Supporters say voter ID requirements are all about preserving electoral integrity. Here's their argument. If you don't make people show photo IDs, you can't guarantee they are who they say they are. Without photo IDs, voters could impersonate other voters, vote more than once, or vote somewhere they don't live. Want to vote? Better have a driver's license, a military ID, a passport, a US citizenship certificate, a state-issued voter ID card, or a handgun license. I mean, this is Texas. That may seem like a lot of options, but at the time, most other states' voter ID rules were a little more chill. They let you use a birth certificate, or official mail with your address on it, or even a student ID. So why were strict voter ID laws such a priority? Alexa Ura, a reporter for the Texas Tribune, says lawmakers claimed that's what their constituents wanted.
The 2011 session was the first session after the Tea Party in Texas really gained control. The concern among Republicans was that their primary voters would have been incredibly unhappy with them if they had not been able to pass this voter ID legislation that needed to be passed immediately because of supposed voter fraud.
In fact, 67% of people favored more restrictive voting laws. But the people who opposed the bill, they said it discriminated against minorities. But wait, minorities can get driver's licenses, or passports, or any of those IDs. How can requiring government IDs be discriminatory?
The list of IDs that were deemed permissible by the legislature were photo IDs that people of color were less likely to have. You might have individuals who don't own cars, and so then they don't need a driver's license.
So even though the law didn't explicitly say anything about race, it was still potentially discriminatory. In 2008, only 4% of white Texans lacked one of those acceptable IDs. But 7% of Black Texans and 9% of Latino and Asian American Texans didn't have one. Minorities vote less often than white people, and minorities are more likely to cite not having a valid ID as the reason they don't vote. What's more, studies show that even if they think they don't have a valid ID, they often do. They just don't know it. But why was this law enacted in the first place?
The reasons that supporters of voter ID laws have put forth is that this will help reduce voter fraud at the polls. Democrats have made claims that Republicans have pushed for voter ID legislation to suppress the votes of voters of color because voters of color in Texas are less likely to support Republicans.
It's true that minorities in Texas tend to support Democrats. 74% of Black Texans and 44% of Latinos consider themselves Democrats. So are Texas Republicans trying to exclude these voters on purpose?
Supporters of voter ID laws have said that they never intended to discriminate against voters of color. They have argued that this law was passed to make elections secure for all voters.
This isn't the first time people have argued over whether Texas voting laws are discriminatory. In 1965, the U.S. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act to prevent discrimination in voting. It included something called a pre-clearance provision. This meant that states and some counties with a history of voting discrimination, such as Texas, had to get the okay from the federal government before they could change any voting laws. So even though Texas passed SB 14 in May 2011, federal judges blocked it pretty much immediately. But then in 2013, the Supreme Court changed the game. They decided the whole pre-clearance list was unconstitutional because it was outdated and irrelevant. Federal restrictions on Texas? Off. Voter ID laws? Back on. So the fight over voter ID laws kept going. Federal courts struck down the law 4 times. So, in 2017, Texas lawmakers passed a new, milder bill known as Senate Bill 5, SB 5. Kind of a voter ID light. Under SB 5, Texans can vote without a photo ID, as long as they show some type of supporting document and sign a declaration swearing that they really can't get a photo ID. In theory, this makes voting easier. If you have what Texas calls a reasonable impediment to getting an ID, you can show your utility bill, or paycheck, or one of a few other documents you might have handy. And if you have a photo ID but forgot it at home, you can still vote. Just show up with your ID within 6 days. So SB 5 was a lot less strict. Discrimination problem solved, right? Not so fast. Even though voter ID light wasn't as strict, a U.S. district judge for the Southern District of Texas still blocked it in August 2017.
She ruled that it was still discriminatory and that the issues had not been fixed because it was still based on a law that was discriminatory against voters of color.
The judge was referring to the earlier, stricter law, SB 14. She wrote, "The court has found that SB 14 was enacted with discriminatory intent, knowingly placing additional burdens on a disproportionate number of Hispanic and African American voters." Judge Ramos wasn't saying the law happens to make things harder for minorities. She believed SB 14 was designed to do that. And she thought that any law based on a discriminatory law had to be discriminatory too. Voter ID law, down. But not for long. In April 2018, a panel of judges threw out Ramos's findings and upheld SB 5. This court, the Fifth Circuit Court based in New Orleans, didn't buy Judge Ramos's argument that the new law should be blocked just because the old one was.
They ruled that by then, lawmakers had done enough to fix some of the issues that were flagged with the original legislation known as SB 14.
So the law stands. Texas can ask for photo ID, as long as it offers alternatives for people who don't have it. But the fight probably isn't over. So is the law really about protecting an election's integrity, or is it about keeping certain people from voting? Both sides say they're trying to protect the integrity of the vote. If this is something you care about, you can vote for politicians who feel the same way you do. Just make sure you bring your ID.